I'm the one who will not raise taxes. The Congress will push me to raise taxes, and I'll say no, and they'll push, and I'll say no, and they'll push again, and I'll say to them, read my lips.
You know, if you've only been following politics for the last 20 years or so, you might think that Republicans have always been adamantly anti-tax, always dug in against any increase in taxes in any way. Not true. If you're wondering why the Republicans are now so dug in against President Obama's proposals, his proposals last night for higher tax rates for the rich, it actually goes back to a lesson Republicans believe they learned when Barack Obama was in law school. You just heard Vice President George H.W. Bush in 1988 accepting the Republican Party's nomination for president at their convention in New Orleans and branding the Republican Party as the anti-tax party more clearly and more emphatically than ever before. Read my lips, no new taxes, became the most memorable line from that presidential campaign. 2 years later, just 2 years later, as president, George H.W. Bush signed the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1990, which increased the top tax rate from 28% to 31%. It also increased the alternative minimum tax from 21 to 24%. It increased the gas tax by a nickel. The cigarette tax went up 8 cents a pack. And in an affront to that mythical blue-collar voter all politicians want to appeal to, Joe Sixpack, a six-pack of beer was taxed an additional 16 cents. And finally, the Budget Act of 1990, signed by President Bush after saying, read my lips, no new taxes, invented a whole new set of taxes, luxury sales taxes on automobiles, boats, personal aircraft, and fur coats. President Bush had simply done what President Reagan had done before him. He reached a compromise agreement with Democrats to raise taxes as part of a deficit reduction package, a package that included 70% spending cuts that the Democrats didn't like and 30% tax increases that President Bush and the Republicans didn't like, but the president compromised on it. That's what bipartisan compromise used to look like in Washington. And then the worst thing in the world happened. Well, the worst thing for the future possibility of tax compromises between Democrats and Republicans. President Bush lost his re-election bid to the Democrat, Bill Clinton, who campaigned on a middle-class tax cut. That's right, the Democrat got to campaign against a tax-raising Republican president claiming that he, the Democrat, would cut taxes when he was elected president. Bill Clinton won, and then instead of cutting taxes, he actually proposed, and the Democrats in Congress passed, the biggest tax increase in history. Clinton's campaign promise of a middle-class tax cut disappeared, just like President Bush's campaign promise, read my lips, no new taxes. And from President Bush's defeat, modern Republicans took the lesson that we Republicans must never, ever, ever again compromise with Democrats on raising taxes. Never again, not one penny, not ever. Read my lips, no new taxes. Every Republican who has made that promise since George H.W. Bush broke that promise has really meant that promise. They have kept that promise. Not one Republican vote has been cast for an increase in federal taxation of any kind since 1990. Joining me now is Bruce Bartlett, who served as executive director of the Joint Economic Committee, as a senior policy analyst in the Reagan White House, and as deputy assistant secretary of the Treasury during George H.W. Bush's administration. He is now a columnist for the Fiscal Times and a contributor for the New York Times, and he's the author of the new book, The Benefit and the Burden, Tax Reform, Why We Need It and What It Will Take. Bruce, thank you very much for joining me tonight.
Happy to be here.
Bruce, what do you make of my theory that the worst thing that happened to reasonable tax policy in this country is that President Bush was defeated in his reelection after agreeing to a tax increase compromise with Democrats? And let me just stipulate, on a personal level, Bill Clinton beating President Bush was one of the best things that ever happened to me in my own career. I was instantly elevated to running the Finance Committee in the Senate under a Democratic president, and was very much a part of working hard to do that big tax increase that we did. So this is leaving my personal benefit aside from President Clinton's win, and there's all sorts of other benefits to President Clinton's win from a Democratic perspective. But for the future of tax policy and the tax dialogue between the parties, it seems to me that President Bush getting defeated after reaching a compromise with Democrats on taxation has eliminated, for as long as we can now see, any possibility of another Republican-Democrat tax compromise.
Well, it certainly looks that way as of right now. And as you recall, Bush got virtually no Republican votes in the House or Senate on that 1990 legislation. I think there were a couple you may remember better than I do. But I think there's another a story to this, which is 1990 is the last time you had a leading Republican figure, a president, who cared about the deficit. I mean, that's the other part to this, is that Republicans simply, they talk, good line, but in their mythology, deficits are never caused by lower revenues, only by higher spending. And that's just complete nonsense. A huge part of the deficit right now is the fact that we have among the lowest taxes as a share of the GDP in our history. And I don't think very many people know that.
Bruce, in your book, you have a passage that is dead on to where our politics are today on this. You say, people used to be incensed when the rich paid tax rates lower than those barely in the middle class. Today, they don't seem to care. Why? I don't know. I think it may have to do with the decline of the balanced budget as an expected norm in budget policy. It seems to me that the budget rule as being the Buffett rule as being pushed by the president, Mitt Romney's release of tax returns at the same time, seems to have possibly raised this issue to the point where people will care.
I hope so, but the point I was trying to make is that if you assume that deficits will lead to higher taxes, then it makes sense that if somebody else is cheating on their taxes, it comes at your expense. You may have to pay higher taxes in the future because this guy's cheating. But if you take the Republican idea that deficits don't matter, as Vice President Cheney once said, then it doesn't really matter if somebody else is cheating on their taxes. It doesn't come at your expense. So I think that's the point I was trying to get at. And also, if you believe that higher spending leads to higher taxes, then you're going to want to restrain spending. But if deficits don't matter, then higher spending never has any cost. So I think the Republican policy of never raising taxes has, ironically, led to higher spending.
Bruce, you point out something that I didn't notice in the book. You mentioned that we all know that President George W. Bush was a big tax cutter. But it's also true, you say here, that he was the only president since we've invented the tax code who never raised a single tax in any way.
Well, at least since Hoover. I don't think Coolidge raised any taxes, but every president since Herbert Hoover has raised taxes to some degree or another, and but George W. Bush never did. And there's a footnote in my a Treasury document that explains that.
It hasn't always been this way. Bruce Bartlett, your new book is The Benefit and the Burden. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.